Even better yet than figuring out that there are vampires everywhere is the fact that people heard of them. And one pretty good example of that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher who is arguing about religion with another philosopher during his time. In this case, actually, a archbishop who kind of accuses Rousseau of being a bad believer. And so they have this pretty deep discussion on the reality of religious facts, whether or not the religious facts can be observed by anyone and everyone, or whether they require the influence of the clergy to influence them. And so Rousseau, being Swiss, is very much influenced by the Protestant tradition. The Archbishop of where it is, I think it might actually even be Paris, complains that well, the religious facts are not just up for grabs; they are not just for anyone to to interpret, not freely. And Rousseau goes on through making sense of certain miracles or certain facts that he believes should be made sense out of in the most scientific of ways, rather than relying on an external explanation. So that is essentially making the difference between the reason, the reasonable explanation, and kind of the religious revelation that could happen as a result. And so Rousseau says, I beg you to consider then that this is entirely appropriate for human facts to be witnessed by human testimonies. This cannot be done by any other way. I can know that Sparta and Rome existed only because contemporary authors tell me so, and between me and another man who lived long ago, there must necessarily be intermediaries. But why must there be some between God and me, and why must they be so remote, therefore needing so many others? It is simple and is it natural that God should have sought out Moses in order to speak to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he's talking to himself, and he's wondering why we would require the intercession of an ancient prophet to make sense of God. And he goes on, if there is a well-attested history in the world, it is that of the vampires. Nothing is missing from it. Interrogations, certifications by notables, surgeons, parish priests, magistrates. The judicial proof is one of the most complete. And with all that, who believes in vampires? Will we be damned for not having believed? So there's plenty of evidence of vampires, of people who have seen vampires, and Rousseau is making sense of previous writings by French philosophers, especially, who tried to make sense of all those weird traditions that existed during this time. This is a dissertation on apparitions and revenants. We mentioned that also in the context of zombie, I believe, kind of this all-encompassing term for undead or spirit. This is written by Don Camay, a French Benedictine monk, who sought to make sense out of well, those bookends that I mentioned in a previous video. And he made this compilation of supernatural stories, including eyewitness accounts from people who claim to have seen vampires or people that came down back from the dead. And the his conclusion is that well, for all of the existence that or all of the quote unquote proof that is given outside of the world, there still doesn't seem to be any solid proof that that vampires exist. So there's tales about vampires, there's stories of vampires, but at the end of the day, he points out that there's no reason to believe in them. But well, in the time that he was writing, Don Camillo was kind of ridiculed for even paying attention to the stories of werewolves and vampires and ghosts and whatnot. And eventually, he was very much criticized for paying attention to this. And it was a very real dispute in Christianity and Catholicism at the time, that some things could be seen, but some things could not be seen. And trying to prove things by science, especially in the science of the day, would have seemed pretty awkward. But Calmea, as part of his dissertation, classifies vampires according to his, you see at the bottom there, esprit, that is spirits. And so what we tell about vampires are the undead of Hungary, of Moravia, of Poland, the Vrukolak of Greece, of the excommunicated. You all of them do not, whose body do not rot. Um, I thought I had given enough care and been able to show enough information outside of making their own book separated from the other apparitions of the spirits. So he has plenty of information and enough really to separate it from the other forms of spirits that are out there. But really, well, eventually it just puts it within. He puts vampires within the same category as other spirits. And there are all kinds of letters during that time. So here, this is a letter from the Jewish letters, so dated from 1738. We have just seen as one of the in the so I'm reading now. We have just seen in the neighborhoods of Hungary the scene of vampirism that is truly. Uh, Truly vouched for by officers of the Tribunal of Belgrade, the justices of the peace, essentially, who went to the place and saw the officers and showed the emperor, who was a a witness, first-hand witness to the scene. So high-ranking military working for the court of the emperor saw a witness was a witness to vampires. This is the story of an old man who dies and come back from the dead, and apparently anyway, and so the family goes back looking for him, and he is found sleeping in a coffin in the cemetery. So, well, we have a proof, quote unquote, of a vampire in the newspapers of the day. The only way to take care of this guy is is to make sure that he is dead. Another story here of Peter Plogojewicz had died 10 weeks past. He lived in the village of Kisilova in the Ram district and had been buried according to Red Sin custom. It was revealed that in the same village of Kisilova, within a week, 9 people, both old and young, died also after suffering a 24-hour illness. And they said publicly, while they were yet alive, but on their deathbed, that the above-mentioned Plogojewicz, who had died 10 weeks earlier, had come to them in their sleep, laid himself on them, and throttled them so that they would have to give up the ghost. The hair and beard. So they go to investigate this Plogojevich who died. So he tried to strangle people. He's not biting them like vampires. Their hair and the beard. When they find his body, even the nails of which the old ones had fallen away had grown on him. The old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new fresh one had submerged under it. The face, the hands and feet, and the whole body were so constituted that they could not have been more complete in his lifetime. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth, which, according to the most common observation, he had sucked from the people killed by him. In short, all of the indications were present that such people, as remarked above, are said to have. So they find this person who seems to be well alive, even though he is dead, and his flesh looks fine. His nails have grown, his hair has grown, and well, we know this is something that happens after death. But he is also full of blood. Well, probably because he is rotting inside, and his blood is kind of flowing around. But this is the 18th century, 1720 something. Yeah, so what they do is they burn him, and well, hopefully that should take care of that body, of course, not him coming back from the dead. There are other later accounts in which instead of burning him, they drive a stake through his heart to make sure that the vampire, quote unquote, dies. All this to say that, well, the science of the 18th century was not what it is today, which is something that might be a little bit different for us to think about, especially when we read any kind of scientific account or anything that has to do with proof. This book here from Robert Boyle from 1666. Oh, that's spooky. Tells us about the beginning of scientific experiments. Before that, there was no experimentation being done. The amount of work that could be done by scientists was really about trial and error. Boyle, who is better known for Boyle's Law, which is the basic principle of chemistry that we understand today to make sense of the pressure and volume of gas, tells us that it is the part of the mineralist both to discover new mines and to work those that are already discovered by separating and melting the ores to reduce them into perfect metals. So I esteem that it becomes a naturalist not only to devise hypotheses and experiments, but to examine and improve those that are already found out. So, yeah, so this is the beginning of modern science, really. Very, very soon before the stories of vampires that we just read. And, well, obviously, the foundation for what today we would call experiments, not just looking at a fact and making sure it happens, but maybe repeating it, or maybe making sure somebody else can repeat it to know that this is not a fluke, but rather a scientific principle or a law, if you will. The concepts of science that we know have existed for a very long time, but up until that time, for example, there was still a very widespread belief that you could turn any kind of metal into gold. That was the goal of alchemy for a while. And Robert Boyle, doing his research, tried to see if there was any possibility that you could turn any other metal into gold. And so he experimented. He did not try to see what the principles might be, but rather try to see if it was even possible. So making sense of aspects of substance and essence, the way that the ancient Greeks did, and using that with his own knowledge of gas, of ores, of metal, of texture, and everything. Blood? Question mark. The people who were trying to make sense out of the human body eventually turned their activity to how the blood impacts the human body. And of course, this is the same time where we are discovering how the human body works, including the blood circulating through the body. But again, right, these are the pioneers of science, so this would not have been common knowledge at the time. We have found that none of all these spirits by dissection, neither in the veins, nerves, arteries, or any of the living animals. So scientists look into people's blood to see if they could find spirits, and they could not. Surprise. Some speak of corporeal, others of incorporeal spirits, and they who advocate for the corporeal spirits will have the blood and the other thinner portion of the blood to be the bond of union with the soul, the spirit being contained in the blood as the flame is in the smoke of the candle or lamp, and held admixed, so mixed with, by the incessant motion of the fluids. Others again distinguish between the spirits and the blood. They who advocate incorporeal spirits have no ground of experience to stand upon. Their spirits indeed are synonymous with powers or faculties, such as the concoctive spirit, chylopoietic spirit, a procreative spirit, etc. They admit as many spirits, in short, are their faculties of organs. So this is from William Harvey, English physician, who was the first to recognize the circulation of the blood, and including figuring out that there's no spirit in the blood, and spirit here should be understood as a metaphor, not as a physical thing that exists within us. And of course, this is based on the most commonly understood fact of the day that, well, we are made out of soul. And if our soul is inside us, then where does it go? Perhaps it goes into our blood. In Leviticus, for the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one life. So, making sense of blood as a physical capacity within the more metaphorical understanding of religion, of atonement and forgiveness, of people spilling their blood in the most physical and metaphorical ways, kind of mixing those two, is really the principles that was operating at the time. So it should not be surprising that these ancient or not so ancient, but a few hundred-year-old accounts of blood are very simplistic in the sense that blood is the lifeblood in the most elementary of ways, in the least scientific way possible. Your blood is tied to your life. If you lose your life, you lose your blood, or if you lose your blood, you lose your life. So there has to be some kind of very specific magic in the blood that allows for all of this to happen. Well, we are now by 1743, and Albrecht von Hiller, a Swiss anatomist, is making the studies about how the blood is working for us. After death, the veins are found fuller of blood than the arteries. But sometimes when the person, sorry, has been dead a considerable time, the small veins have been found distended with air. But the arteries of a dead body commonly contain only a small quantity of blood. This descending blood then is rapidly moved through all the vessels of a living body. The truth of this, which is demonstrated to us from wounds, by which the patient soon expires from the loss of too much blood, of so much blood as was necessary for the maintenance of life, which loss of blood happens almost instantly from the larger arteries and sometimes very suddenly from the smaller ones, but from the veins, unless they are some of the largest, this loss of blood is more slow and difficult. So by the middle of the 18th century, we have made enough experiments to know that the blood is circulating, that it goes from the arteries into the veins, that it is pumped through our body. And of course, this experiment is done with dead people or dead animals, sometimes living animals, but it took quite a bit of experimenting to figure this out. Besides the fact that, well, again, in the most basic sense, if we don't have blood, we die, and that much was already obvious. So making sense of why people would have blood within them has to do also with this understanding of how the blood is figuring out in our lives. And to a certain extent, this leads with us today because many of the anticoagulants, that is the drugs that are allowing today for our blood to be thin and not to become solid, to coagulate, is taken from natural remedies, including plants and sometimes venom from animals. We'll get back to that a little bit later. But it is also important to note that this is a time when the practice of bloodletting was very common for most ailments. That is to let people bleed the bad stuff. That is to let whatever ailments they have get out of their body by opening a vein, which again, the arteries were seen as having clean blood, the veins were seen as having dirty blood. So if people have the disease in their blood, if you remove that blood, then you are able to remove the disease from them. Sometimes this was done through cutting, sometimes this was done through leeches. Anyway, the possibility of using the blood as a medicine for a lot of people was also discovered during that time. So there's this kind of fascination with blood, and perhaps even the discovery of those early blood disorders when you realize that there are some diseases that are within your blood, whether it's a virus or some of the sort. So combining this understanding with there is a virus going in people's blood and bleeding people to death is allowing them to feel better is something that would essentially be a very valuable knowledge or experimentation, if you will, because again, we are talking about a place on the periphery of science and kind of an incomplete understanding of science. And just in the most simple of terms, the way that we see vampires working as, let's say, being afraid of sunlight or maybe of being gaunt because they are sick. All of those things are very common symptoms of most diseases and don't have much to do with being vampires themselves, but kind of related to a much larger condition that is very easy to expand. So the combination of discovering diseases and the weird political situation of Romania between East and West, between modernity and past was definitely playing into the hand of our understanding of vampires.